Have you ever spent years keeping a company alive, only to watch someone with a shiny degree and zero real-world experience try to replace you with a spreadsheet? Have you ever wondered what happens when arrogance meets a system held together by knowledge, respect, and a little bit of midnight magic? And most importantly, have you ever watched your quiet warning turn into the storm that teaches everyone the lesson they refuse to hear? Because if you have not, then sit with me for a moment. Let me take you into the heart of a story where loyalty was forgotten, ignorance was rewarded, and the people who dismissed me learned exactly why you never underestimate the keeper of the old ways. Now, I want to share my truth. Take a breath, settle in, and listen closely. Because this is the story of how I was pushed aside, how the system collapsed without me, and how I reclaimed every ounce of power they tried to take. My name is Marissa Graywolf. I am 37 years old, born in a small valley outside Gallup, New Mexico, and for 12 long years I served as the senior data infrastructure architect for Sky River Freight, a company that looked powerful on the outside, but survived only because I kept its ancient payroll engine alive. People like to joke that our trainees were younger than the code base, but there was truth in that. The system was older than half our interns, stitched together with patched scripts, handwritten notes that predated me, and more than a few midnight prayers whispered in server rooms that hummed like restless spirits under the concrete floor. They called the system the Old Bones. I did not give it that name, but I understood it. Old bones carry stories, they carry weight, and they carry the memory of the people who once depended on them. I became its keeper not because anyone else wanted the responsibility, but because I was the only one who could hear its warnings, its glitches, its quiet murmurs before a failure. Every union rule, every state tax exception, every hazard shift code, every legacy patch that someone forgot to document 15 years ago, I held it all in my mind. People would laugh about it at meetings, but they knew that without me, the whole operation suffered. I was never proud of the system itself, but I respected it the way my elders taught me to respect the tools that feed your people. When you grow up hearing stories of caretakers, firekeepers, and watchers of the old ways, you learn that sometimes your job is not glamorous, it is simply necessary. And in my heart, I knew that someday someone would underestimate the old bones, and when they did, the reckoning would be loud. I always sensed a storm brewing, even before the day it arrived in a tailored suit and polished shoes that had never touched real dirt. That storm's name was Trevor Langston, our brand new chief operating officer, a man who spoke in smooth, rehearsed lines like he was pitching himself to an invisible audience. He strutted through Sky River Freight with the confidence of someone who believed progress was a shiny object you could flash in front of people to blind them to the truth. He introduced himself to me with a handshake too firm to feel honest and a smile that never reached his eyes. And in that moment, I felt the first ripple in the old bones beneath my feet. Trevor told me he was bringing in fresh energy, a phrase that usually meant someone somewhere was about to be replaced or ignored, and I could already feel his gaze on my seat at the table like he had plans for it. He brought with him a young man named Evan Carlisle, 25 years old, barely out of graduate school, with the kind of confidence gifted to people who have never been tested by the things they claim to understand. Evan carried a brand new laptop, a spotless binder, and a grin that reminded me of a young wolf eager to prove he could hunt, even if he had never seen a real wilderness. Trevor proudly announced that Evan had created an innovative payroll automation model, which, when he showed it to me, turned out to be nothing more than a massive spreadsheet he called a scalable solution. The moment he said he could replace our entire infrastructure with it, I felt resentment stir low in my chest, slow and quiet like distant thunder. I looked at Evan, then at Trevor, and I knew they had no idea what the old bones truly held. I also knew that storms do not listen until lightning speaks, and soon enough, they would hear it. Trevor wasted no time proving that his idea of leadership was less about understanding a system and more about removing anything that reminded him he did not. The very next afternoon, he called me into a glass conference room, the kind where reflections make it hard to tell who is telling the truth. He sat there with Evan to his right and the HR director, Molly Jensen, to his left, as if positioning himself between youth, policy, and the person he planned to discard. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the air settle heavy around me, the way it does in the desert before a dust storm swallows the sky. Trevor spoke slowly, pretending empathy he did not possess, explaining how the company was moving in a new direction and how Evan's modernized solution would make my role redundant. I had heard corporate phrases like that before, usually spoken by people who did not understand the work they were dismantling. Molly slid a termination packet across the table, eyes lowered, as if avoiding mine would lessen her guilt. Evan sat perfectly still, his expression unsure, but not unsure enough to stop any of it. I did not rage. I did not beg. I did not even argue. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet disappointment settle in my chest, layered with something sharper, something like the early notes of revenge forming a steady rhythm under my breath. I gathered the few things I had left on my desk, and when Trevor followed me to the elevator pretending courtesy, I turned to him and said calmly, "Do not feed the old bones after sundown." He laughed, dismissive, waving off my warning like it was folklore instead of foresight. As the elevator doors closed, I felt no fear. My ancestors taught me that when fools invite chaos, it becomes its own teacher. And Trevor, whether he knew it or not, had just opened the door. I later learned that the moment I stepped out of the building, Evan positioned himself in my old chair like a child wearing clothing several sizes too big. He opened his pristine laptop, rolled up sleeves that had never seen a real crisis, and began importing data he did not understand from systems he had never touched. What he did not know, and what Trevor never cared to learn, was that the old bones did not tolerate careless hands. They were temperamental, intricate, and tied together with more than code. They held years of exceptions, late-night patches, and undocumented rules that only made sense because I had lived inside them for more than a decade. Evan's first mistake was believing every column label he saw. Payroll data is not clean, not simple, not orderly. It is full of overrides, union variations, and state-specific tax conditions that shift like river currents. But Evan copied and pasted them into his spreadsheet like it was a simple grocery list. Within an hour, he had mixed up employee identification numbers with shift differentials. Within 2 hours, he created negative pay for forklift drivers who had worked overtime. And by the time the afternoon sun slid behind the loading yard, he had accidentally assigned more than 4,000 work hours to a single warehouse associate, triggering red flags that froze the entire pipeline. He blamed the software. He blamed the format. He even blamed legacy inefficiencies, which was ironic because the only real inefficiency in the room was his lack of understanding. What he did not realize was that my API keys, the ones needed to calculate taxes across 9 states and 5 unions, were tied only to my encrypted credentials. Without those keys, his spreadsheet was nothing but a table filled with well-organized nonsense. The old bones do not respond to arrogance. They respond to respect. And in that moment, they chose silence. The kind of silence that warns of consequences coming far sooner than anyone expects. By the time Thursday morning arrived, the entire payroll system was wobbling like a tired horse forced to carry a rider who did not know how to sit a saddle. Evan had been trying to fix his spreadsheet for nearly 2 days, bouncing between panic and pride, insisting he could still optimize the model even as it grew bloated with errors. He added new formulas, more tabs, more lookup tables, each one stacking on top of the last until the document became a labyrinth no one could navigate, not even him. The old bones had stayed patient longer than I expected, but patience has its limits, especially when deadlines are carved into stone. At Sky River Freight, Thursday at noon is not a suggestion. It is the final moment when the payroll file must be transmitted to the bank. Miss it, and 12,000 workers do not get paid on time. The Federal Reserve does not care about excuses. and neither do families counting on those deposits. Inside the operations building, people whispered in hallways, sensing something was wrong but afraid to ask. Trevor locked himself in his office, pretending to be on important calls. Evan sat hunched over his laptop, eyes red, hands shaking, clicking through tabs that took 30 seconds each to load because the spreadsheet had grown to nearly 3 gigabytes. At exactly 11:57 a.m., Evan attempted a final upload. The system froze. He tried again at 11:58. Frozen. At 11:59, he clicked the transmit button one more time, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. The wheel spun, the screen flickered, and then everything went white. Excel crashed. When it reopened, half the data was corrupted. At 12:04 p.m., the deadline passed quietly, almost respectfully, like the moment before a wildfire leaps from a ridge. By 12:06, everyone in the payroll wing knew. By 12:07, silence filled the building like smoke. And by 12:10, the first sparks of chaos had begun their slow, inevitable crawl toward the heart of the company. By dawn on Friday, the consequences of that missed deadline spread across the country like a cold wind rolling over open plains. Drivers in Texas, Nevada, Montana, and the Dakotas woke up, checked their bank accounts, and saw the same thing staring back at them. Nothing. No pay. No deposits. No explanations. For some, that missing paycheck meant overdue rent. For others, it meant empty refrigerators. For all of them, it meant betrayal. Sky River Freight was built on the backs of working people, and nothing enrages workers faster than being told their sweat does not matter. Phones at regional offices lit up before the sun did. Dispatchers tried to calm the storm, saying it must be a minor glitch. But truckers are not fools. They know the difference between a glitch and a failure, and word travels fast on long highways. By 5 a.m., union group chats were flooded with screenshots of empty accounts. By 5:15, talk of a work stoppage had already begun. And by 5:26 a.m., Tyrell Bear Hawkins, the union leader whose voice carried like thunder, sent a single message: park them. Within 30 minutes, hundreds of 18-wheelers formed a blockade around the main distribution hub outside Tulsa. Engines idled like restless beasts. Headlights pointed at the gates as if daring the company to challenge them. The drivers stepped out, crossed their arms, and waited. The news helicopters arrived shortly after, circling above the sea of chrome and steel. Reporters shouted questions, trying to understand how a company that boasted about efficiency every quarter could fail at something as basic as paying its own people. Inside corporate headquarters, Trevor panicked. Evan hid in a meeting room, pale as winter. HR scrambled for statements, none of them good enough. The CEO had not even arrived yet, but the story was already spreading faster than wildfire on dry grass. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, I sipped my morning coffee, feeling the wind shift, carrying the unmistakable scent of a reckoning these men had chosen with their own hands. By the time the sun climbed past the rooftops, Sky River's crisis had reached every corner of the company. Executives were trapped inside conference rooms, lawyers were whispering about liability, and the finance team was drowning in emails marked urgent. Reports of halted shipments spread across the news like wildfire, jumping from treetop to treetop. Still, I had no intention of stepping into their mess. Not yet. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning light creeping across the wood, and watched my phone vibrate with an aggression that would have been flattering under different circumstances. The first call from CEO Lydia Rowan came at 8:12 a.m. I let it ring. The second came at 8:17. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each time, I simply placed the phone face down, listening to the muffled buzzing like a distant drumbeat. It was not pettiness. It was clarity. For years, I had warned them that the old bones required respect, patience, and knowledge they did not value. Now they needed me, And the ancestors teach that when people do not listen to warnings, they learn through consequences. The fifth call came with a voicemail. The sixth came with a message from HR trying to sound calm, urging me to consider assisting during this unexpected situation. Unexpected. That word nearly made me laugh. This was not unexpected. This was engineered. It was crafted by arrogance, rushed decisions, and a blind trust in spreadsheets that had never touched the heartbeat of real labor. Finally, on the seventh call, Lydia herself spoke when I answered, her voice tight and brittle, the voice of a leader watching her empire crack down the middle. "Marissa, we need you." There was no pretense, no executive polish, no false control. I listened, letting her desperation hang in the air a moment longer, feeling the shift of power settle gently into my hands. For the first time in years, they were finally hearing me. And I had not said a single word yet. Lydia did not waste time with niceties. The tremble in her voice told me she was calling from a place of urgency executives rarely admit to. I could hear the muffled chaos behind her, the hurried footsteps, the raised voices, the sound of a company unraveling thread by thread. "Marissa," she said, "we need immediate assistance. We are facing regulatory penalties, union threats, and—" I gently interrupted. "I know." There was a pause, a long one, the kind that signals a shift in balance. For 12 years, they spoke over me. Today, they would listen. I told her calmly that I was willing to help, but not under the old terms, not as the woman they dismissed with a packet and a manufactured smile. I would return only as a consultant with full authority, proper compensation, and respect. Real respect, written into contract ink rather than spoken in desperation. Lydia inhaled sharply, bracing herself. "What do you want?" she asked. I laid it out without hesitation. $40,000 up front for the emergency weekend alone, a 1-year consulting contract at triple my former salary, direct reporting only to the chief technology officer, not to Trevor, not to any middle manager who had mocked my methods. And, I added, I want a written apology from Trevor Langston and Evan Carlisle admitting their error in replacing a critical system with an untested model. Lydia exhaled slowly, the sound of someone swallowing pride because the fire was already at her door. She agreed faster than I expected. Panic has a way of making even the highest-ranking individuals humble. Before ending the call, I said gently, "You should also clear my path." "I do not work in places cluttered with excuses," Lydia responded. "Consider it done." At that moment, I realized the power imbalance that once pushed me aside had shifted entirely. They were no longer hiring me. They were depending on me. And that small, quiet victory tasted sweeter than I expected. When I walked back into Sky River Freight that Friday evening, the entire building felt different, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath, waiting for someone who actually knew how to steady the storm. The security guards, who had watched me leave only days earlier with a cardboard box, now nodded with a mixture of relief and respect. They knew trouble when they saw it. And they knew I was here to put an end to it. Inside the operations wing, the atmosphere resembled a battlefield. Papers were scattered across tables, monitors glowed with error warnings, and employees whispered in tense clusters. When they saw me, their shoulders dropped as if the weight of the last 24 hours finally had somewhere else to land. Evan was the first person I passed. He sat slumped in a chair outside the server room with his laptop open on his knees, staring at a spreadsheet so broken that even the screen seemed embarrassed. The moment he saw me, his eyes went wide like a child caught touching a ceremonial drum he had no right to play. He scrambled to stand, nearly dropping his computer, and stammered, I did not know. I held up a hand, not with anger, but with finality. "Step aside," I said. He did, quickly, without another word. The server room greeted me with its familiar hum, a sound I had missed more than I expected. The old bones were wounded, deeply, but I could still feel their pulse beneath the chaos. I rolled up my sleeves, logged in using the emergency credentials Lydia reinstated, and began the slow, delicate work of bringing the system back to life. 14 hours. 14 hours of cleansing corrupted tables, reversing errors, rebuilding scripts, and coaxing the infrastructure back into alignment. I worked with the precision of a healer stitching torn sinew. And at exactly 1:22 a.m., the payroll file transmitted successfully. At 1:45 a.m., confirmation arrived. Families would be paid. The crisis would end. And the old bones, my old bones, had risen again under the hands that understood them best. When Monday morning arrived, the energy at Sky River Freight felt entirely different, as if the storm had washed away the false confidence that once filled its halls. I walked through the front doors not as the woman they dismissed, but as the consultant who had saved their entire operation from collapsing under its own arrogance. Employees who once nodded politely now greeted me with genuine gratitude, the kind that comes from understanding who truly keeps a company alive. Their respect settled around me like warm sunlight at dawn, slow and steady, earned and unshakable. My new office, a corner space with tall windows overlooking the loading yard, waited for me, furnished with the equipment I had requested and a nameplate already placed on the door. The same executives who once overlooked my expertise now ensured everything was arranged precisely to my preferences, as if afraid to make another mistake. Even the custodial crew smiled at me, whispering that things finally felt right again. I felt no spite, only the quiet satisfaction that rises when balance restores itself. Trevor was nowhere near the executive wing. Word had already spread that he had been reassigned to a lower operational role, one that required him to report directly to the chief technology officer, and by extension, to me. He avoided eye contact in the hallways. His voice, once loud and swaggering, became small, like wind losing strength before crossing a canyon. Evan did not return at all. His internship and temporary contract had been abruptly terminated. His apology letter, stiff and formal, sat unopened on my new desk. I would read it when I felt ready, not because I needed closure, but because he needed humility. As for me, I began planning the $2 million modernization project Lydia approved. My project, built with my vision, using systems that honored the work and the workers they served. The old bones would soon be laid to rest respectfully, replaced not by arrogance but by architecture shaped with knowledge and care. For the first time in years, I felt peace. And I wondered, as I watched the trucks roll again, what the audience would say if they stood where I stood. Would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know. If there is one lesson my journey taught me, it is this: sometimes life does not let you fight the storm. Sometimes it asks you to become it. Every dismissal, every disrespect, every underestimated skill becomes a spark, and when the moment is right, that spark turns into a fire powerful enough to light your whole path forward. So now I want to know your thoughts. Have you ever been replaced, overlooked, or underestimated, only for the truth to speak louder than anyone expected? Tell me in the comments. Your experiences, your anger, your victories. I read them all, I learned from them all, and together we keep these stories alive. Because every voice matters. And this is Revenge Vault.